All right, we ready? Well, first, thanks so much for coming. I know there is some really tough competition from parallel sessions. Let me start with some motivation. Well, first of all, what are witchcraft beliefs? By witchcraft beliefs, I'm going to mean what probably comes to your mind whenever you think about it, which I'm sure happens regularly. So witchcraft beliefs are simply beliefs in the ability of some people to cause harm to other people via supernatural means, such as curses or spells. And when you think about witchcraft beliefs, perhaps things from medieval Europe come to your mind, and that's totally all right. However, I want to disappoint you in the sense that witchcraft beliefs are very much widespread in the modern world as well. And so in fact, if you just take the available country-level surveys and do some simple extrapolation, you can easily count tens and honestly hundreds of millions of people who claim to believe in witchcraft. Now, why am I saying unfortunately? Unfortunately, because witchcraft beliefs and accusations of witchcraft still represent a serious matter. And people accused of witchcraft may face severe sanctions, from destruction of their property to ostracism and even killing. And unfortunately, even today, every year hundreds of people are being killed following witchcraft accusations. Now, beyond that, witchcraft beliefs and the fears that they cause have been argued to represent a brake on economic development. And I can see Jean-Philippe in the audience. He was one of the pioneers in that literature. In an earlier paper of mine, I show that local prevalence of witchcraft beliefs in Sub-Saharan Africa is negatively associated to various measures of what we call social capital and what we believe is kind of essential for a normal functioning of an economy. But here, I'm going to take all of this as a given, and I'm going to flip the question and try to ask myself, well, where do they come from? I'm not going to explain where witchcraft beliefs are coming from, but I'm going to focus on one specific event, very important event in global history that I will argue contributed to the propagation of persistent witchcraft beliefs in important parts of the world. This event was the Atlantic slave trade, and the parts of the world are Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, what on earth does slave trade have to do with witchcraft beliefs? And that's a very reasonable question. In fact, the idea of connecting the two is totally not mine. I came across a very nice book by Rosalind Shaw, who is an anthropologist at Tufts University in Boston area. And so in her book from 2002, she describes her field work among the Temne people who live in northern Sierra Leone and adjacent countries. And in particular, she explores their witchcraft beliefs and related rituals. So the conclusion that she makes is that those beliefs and rituals represent a response to the historical trauma of the Atlantic slave trade, and she calls those beliefs memories of slave trade. So I thought that was very exciting, but of course for us economists, one book by an anthropologist is one observation, and so that's not enough for the quantitative creatures like us. So I started digging further to see whether there is anything else from other sources, and it turned out that there is. And in fact, there are remarkably similar narratives coming from very different regions in Sub-Saharan Africa, which all kind of point to the same directions. So what are those directions? There are two bundles of facts / hypotheses that come from my reading of this literature. And so I want to talk briefly about each of these two channels relating the slave trade experience and witchcraft beliefs. The first channel relies on a very basic notion about witchcraft beliefs. Perhaps one of the very few things we know characterize witchcraft beliefs wherever we look at them. And that feature has to do with the fact that the very narrow purpose of witchcraft beliefs is to explain, quote-unquote, bad stuff. So explain misfortune. So if somebody dies in the family, or there is sickness, or crop failure, or business failure, etc., that must be witchcraft. And so in this sense, the slave trade was a centuries-long source of misfortune and total misery for millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa. And so it's not surprising that many anthropologists and historians write that the slave trade per se was perceived by the local population as a new form of malevolence and a new form of witchcraft in which the white witches, the Europeans, collaborated with local witches, intermediaries in sub-Saharan Africa to essentially enrich themselves almost literally at the expense of African souls and lives. This view was very general across Africa, and if you take a look at my paper, you can find some juicy quotes that I don't have time for here. It also fits very nicely in the zero-sum worldview characteristic of witchcraft believers, and that caused Hawthorne, a historian, essentially called the Atlantic slave trade, or turning people into profit, witchcraft par excellence. So in sum, this bundle of facts / hypothesis says that the Atlantic slave trade represented a huge negative shock, not unlike an epidemic that lasts for more than 4 centuries, and that enormous shock to the population reinforced their local cultural views of evil in the form of witchcraft beliefs. The second bundle is somewhat easier to understand, and the evidence here, the anecdotal evidence from historians and anthropologists, points to the fact that the rise of the slave trade caused a spike in witch trials that became, over time, an integral part of the slave production system. How did this work? This worked very simply. People accused of witchcraft were sold into slavery as punishment, okay? Often along with their families who were not even the accused ones. Now, to avoid long quotations and so on that you can find in the paper, I'm just listing a variety of case studies that I could dig up in the anthropology literature and history literature. And the way I list these studies is from north to south. And you can see that pretty much the whole Atlantic coast of Africa is covered here, all the way from Upper Guinea, or what we now call Guinea-Bissau, down to Angola and Zambia. In all of those places, there is evidence at the anecdotal level, based on archival records, etc., that witch trials were actively used as a vehicle to supply slaves. And so here the idea is that in places that were more exposed to the Atlantic slave trade, those witch trials were more frequently used to produce the slaves, and the frequent application of witch trials led to the persistence of witchcraft beliefs in those regions. So there are these two bundles of facts / hypotheses, and at this point I realized this is really interesting and not a fluke. It's not just about the Temne in the Sierra Leone. And then I also realized that in fact we have all the data necessary, or we can put them together to do what we as economists like to do, right? To quantify things and to try to explore this question a bit more systematically. And so that's what I'm doing. So the paper has two parts. The first part is on the source of slaves, which is sub-Saharan Africa, and the second part is the destination, which in my case would be Latin America. So we started the source, and then I'll switch to the destination. So where do I get the data from? The main data set is the same source that I used in my earlier paper, and this is a range of surveys conducted by the Washington-based Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. So these are the surveys covering 19 countries in sub-Saharan Africa in 2008-2009. So these are data on contemporary witchcraft beliefs. Now, the purpose of the survey, as you may guess, was not to explore witchcraft beliefs at all. It was to actually track the spread of Christianity and Islam through sub-Saharan Africa. But some kind people included a module on traditional beliefs, or so-called traditional beliefs, and that's the module that I exploit to extract my data. So how do I measure witchcraft beliefs? How do I capture witchcraft believers? I base this on the information coming from two questions that kind of fit my definition. The first question is very succinct. It's, do you believe in witchcraft? Yes or no? without explaining what witchcraft is at all. The second question is, do you believe that certain people can cast curses or spells that cause bad things to happen to someone? Now that's a bit more detailed and kind of fits the concept that I'm trying to capture. So what I do is I define believers as those who reply yes to at least one of these two questions. So this is the left-hand side. This is just a binary measure, yes or no, believe or not. Now on the right-hand side, I want the data on exposure to slave trade. This one is a no-brainer, right? I just go straight to Nunn and Wanchikon and their data set on ethnic level exposure to slave trades. So they do it very nicely. They provide data for a whole bunch of African ethnic groups and the amount of slaves that were exported from those ethnic groups throughout the period of the slave trade. I take their preferred measure, which is first taking the amount of exports, then normalizes that by the area of the traditional homeland of the respective ethnic group, and then log transforms it. So obviously for this to work, I need to do the matching between the witchcraft surveys and the Nunn and Wanchikon data. And so as a result of this match, I end up with something like 300 distinct ethnic groups. So then I set up the simple regression equation where on the left-hand side we have 0, 1 witchcraft beliefs at the individual level. On the right-hand side, we have slave exports at the ethnic level and a whole bunch of control variables that could be potentially omitted variables. These come at 3 levels of aggregation, so there are some individual level controls, some ethnic level controls, some regional level controls, and country fixed effects on top of that, or alternatively, province fixed effects, which is kind of a rough specification in which exploit within region variation across ethnic groups. So what are these controls? I'm not going to spend too much time explaining every one of them, but these include hopefully all the common suspects that you have in mind. At the individual level, these are education, religion, income proxies. At the ethnic level, these are measures of pre-colonial development, some historical presence of slavery, and the contacts with Europeans beyond the slave trades. At the regional level, these are features that have been argued to be related to either witchcraft beliefs or slave trades. So here's the baseline result. Oops. So as you can see, the coefficient estimate on the slave trade is positive and significant, so consistent with the hypothesis offered by anthropologists and historians, we do find that representatives of ethnic groups today that historically were more exposed to the slave trade or the raids associated with the slave trade, today are more likely to be witchcraft believers. And you can see that the coefficient is pretty much stable across specifications, including the one where I use province fixed effects instead of country fixed effects. Now, interestingly, this is not just about supernatural. So if you replace witchcraft beliefs by other stuff that is part of the survey, things like beliefs in heaven, hell, or reincarnation, angels, miracles, shamans, spirits of ancestors, etc., none of this has anything to do with the slave exports. The only thing that does have something to do with it is belief in evil spirits, and the reason here is that the beliefs in evil spirits, as you may guess, are super highly correlated with beliefs in witchcraft. All right. So then what I do, for those of you who like IVs, even after yesterday's keynote lecture by Anna, I follow the tradition in the slave trade literature and first use distance to the coast from the ethnic group as an instrument for the slave trade. Now I also offer my own refinement of that instrument, or what I think is a refinement, by taking the distance not to the coast but to a major slave port. So for that I use the data on location-based or port-based volume of slave exports I choose the top quartile by volume of trade, and then I measure the distance to the closest slave port, which I think is a more relevant type of instrument, and as you will see, it definitely is stronger than just a simple distance to the coast. So the outcome here is something that we are all used to see in the IV literature. The point estimates are larger than OLS, whatever that means. The point estimates actually are closer to OLS if I use a more refined, so to speak, instrument, but still they're about twice as large as the OLS. If you look at the F stats in the second row, like I said, distance to the major port actually is pretty noticeably stronger than distance to the coast, perhaps not surprisingly so. Okay, so I do many other exercises in this African part of the paper, and you can find them in the draft that is posted on the conference website. But I want to use the time that is left, I hope at least I have 5 minutes or more. Excellent, 8 minutes, to talk a little bit about the second part of the paper, which is about the destination, or Latin America. Now, as you all know, I'm sure, most of the slaves that were shipped from Africa were delivered to either Latin America or the Caribbean. A small fraction, less than 5%, ended up in the United States, but more than 95% landed in either Latin America or the Caribbean, and half of that volume in Brazil alone, or what we call Brazil now. And so the question is, of course, whether witchcraft beliefs or transmission of witchcraft beliefs was part of this cultural exchange that was initiated by what we call Columbian exchange, and whether slaves or the witchcraft beliefs were transmitted together with the slaves in the New World, and whether they found a new home there. So there are two ways I think about it in this paper, in this part of the paper. The first one is more about vertical cultural transmission coupled with physical or mechanical transmission of slaves from Africa to the New World. And so here the notion is that, well, if slaves were witchcraft believers, particularly given all the stories I told you about the enforcement or reinforcement of witchcraft beliefs in the course of the slave trade, then it's reasonable to think that they carried those beliefs with them on slave ships, and then if they transmitted those beliefs to their descendants in the New World, then perhaps if we look at their descendants today, the prevalence of witchcraft beliefs among them should be higher than, say, the prevalence of witchcraft beliefs among the descendants of whites, of Europeans. The second way I think about it has to do both with vertical and horizontal cultural transmission. And so here I'm asking myself whether it's possible that in regions or provinces of Latin America that were more heavily reliant on the use of African slave labor, and thus were more historically populated by Africans, in general, even conditional on the racial belonging, its residents, or residents of those regions, would be more likely to believe in witchcraft. And this is not unlike the presentation by Katya that we saw yesterday. It's about the horizontal transmission from the new residents of those regions to all residents of those regions. So what do I do to check this? Well, first of all, I need new data, right? Because I now want to work with Latin America. Now, luckily for me, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey which was kind of like what they did in Sub-Saharan Africa, and they've recently done it also in Central and Eastern Europe. The surveys in Latin America are structured in the same way as the ones I described for Sub-Saharan Africa, and witchcraft believers are defined in the same way as I explained earlier. But now, on the right-hand side, we don't have slave exports, we have something else. And for my first exercise, what I need to know is the ancestry or race of respondents. So this is not as easy as it may sound, and it took me a while to actually classify the respondents based on their responses into these four groups. The first group, which is what is of particular interest for us, are Afro-descendants. So there are 10% of those. You can see what types of responses were given in this group. The second one are indigenous people, so these are the native populations of Latin America. Then we have whites, or the descendants of Europeans, and finally the fourth, the largest and the messiest category, the mestizos, the mixed race, which are usually a mix of all the three of the above. All right, so let's look at the raw data. If you look at the raw data, and the blue columns here in particular, then it does look like the prevalence of witchcraft beliefs among the Afro-descendants is higher than among the three other groups. You can also see a tiny bit of a higher prevalence among the mestizos compared to the whites and indigenous populations. Obviously, we know there may be a ton of omitted variables bias here, so I set up a regression equation with witchcraft beliefs on the left-hand side, ancestry on the right-hand side, and a bunch of controls. Again, the most important ones are perhaps things like educational level, income proxies, and so on and so forth, country fixed effects. But the result doesn't change relative to the raw data. Okay, we can still see that, first of all, Afro-descendants are more likely than the whites, the omitted category, to be witchcraft believers. The same applies to a smaller extent to mestizos, as we should expect. And interestingly, the indigenous populations are not statistically different from the whites in terms of their beliefs in witchcraft. My final exercise has to do with this horizontal/vertical cultural transmission of witchcraft beliefs. And here what I want to ideally have is disaggregated data on the actual use of African slave labor in Africa and Latin American provinces or regions. I was not able to find that, and so I'm doing the second best, which is to follow historical narratives, etc., and simple logic to back out some kind of geographical feature that made African slave labor particularly profitable for use. And so if we want to summarize the geographical feature in 3 words, that ends up being tropical coastal lowlands, for a number of factors, the most important of which are listed here on this slide. And so what I do next is I pick up a map of ecological regions of Latin America, and I just go through it and mark all the regions, ecological regions put together by geographers that fall into the TCL category, tropical coastal lowlands. And these are the tropical coastal lowlands. And then I take the regions from my Pew survey and just measure the fraction of regions area that falls into this belt, which is sort of my proxy for the belt of the heavy use of African slave labor. I also build simpler proxies like elevation level, and distance to the coast. But share in TCL, I think, is the most comprehensive one. And then I rerun my earlier regressions, but also including these geographic features at the regional level. So if you look at the last column, you can see that even conditional on race or ancestry, regions or residents of regions that are overlapping the TCL belt are more likely to believe in witchcraft. Same for, or the opposite sign, regions with high elevation, right? Those are the regions where we still find indigenous peoples, the Andes and so on. So you can see that both hypotheses in this rough exercise still kind of find confirmation. Both ancestry is important and the location of residence. To sum up, these exercises are consistent with the notion that witchcraft beliefs are systematically related to the history of the Atlantic slave trade. So I show continuity of witchcraft beliefs both across time and space, and all of this is consistent with the historical and anthropological narratives that kind of inspired me to do this. Thank you very much.
This is a super interesting thing. I have 2 questions. One about TCL, as you defined it. It would be nice to find some other area which has variation in TCL, which didn't have any slave trade, to show that it's through the slave trade and there's no direct effect of TCL. That's first. And the second question which I have, can you spell out a little bit for me, because I'm not quite sure I understood the mechanism. Because first, when you talked about the formation of these beliefs, I thought that the local population basically deemed witches those whom they sold. Basically, instead of killing them, they just selling them. But if that's the case, then I don't quite understand how on the receiver side you have persistent beliefs, because probably those who were sold didn't think of themselves as witches, and there must be some kind of other mechanism, and I just missed it. Thank you.
Okay, these are great questions. I hope I'm not going to use all the 5 minutes replying to them. So the first question, I did that. So there is a Pew survey on, I have like 50 slides in the appendix. The Pew conducted the surveys in Asian countries or Muslim majority countries. And so those countries were not really affected much by the slave trade. So I take those countries, don't remember how many of them, okay, 25 countries, mostly in Asia, in the Middle East. And so I take their subnational regions, as I do in the Latin American case, and I show that the prevalence of witchcraft beliefs there is not related whatsoever to either distance to the coast or elevation. So that's partly addressing your question. The second question is about mechanism. So I explained that the two theories have been offered, right, as sort of a big shock, not unlike an epidemic, that triggered this witchcraft beliefs. And by the way, I should have mentioned that it's not a paper about the origin of beliefs, it's about persistence, differential persistence. So the notion is that they were pre-existing ones when the slave trade occurred or started rolling out, but then there was differential persistence. With regard to who were the witches, it's an excellent point, and it took me a while to get that, but what you said was exactly right. On the one hand, the Europeans were the witches. On the other hand, the accused were the witches. So you can find witches among the slaves. And one historian put it very nicely as, as the fight of witch versus witch. So the slave owners in Brazil were afraid of the slaves because, some of them were convicted witches. And the slaves in Brazil were actually thinking of their slave owners as witches because they were doing horrible things to them. So it's a very kind of ironic situation.
So I think you just skimmed past it with the your appendix slides, but my question was about, with the Nunn-Wanchicon paper, is it that witchcraft led to mistrust, or is it mistrust reinforcing witchcraft in some sense? I mean, it looked like you controlled for one, but it wasn't clear if you could actually unpack that.
Yeah, so my best response is that neither. Okay, so how do I do that? So there is a famous paper by Nunn and Wanchicon that shows mistrust is related to slave trades. There is a lesser-known paper by myself where I show that witchcraft beliefs are related to mistrust. And so what's going on, right? Now I'm saying witchcraft beliefs are related to slave trades. So I'm doing kind of a dirty type of exercise where I'm rerunning my regressions, controlling for trust. I can do it because I actually have trust measures in my regressions. Okay, neither Nathan nor Leonard are here, so I can say that in my sample, trust is completely unrelated to slave trades. So not surprisingly, when I control for trust, nothing at all happens to my result. Then I take their exercise and replicate their exercise controlling for the prevalence of witchcraft beliefs, and their estimates are just a tiny bit reduced, but not much happens either. So whether I control for witchcraft beliefs or trust, it seems to do nothing at all with either mine or their estimates. And so my best guess at the moment is that both witchcraft beliefs and mistrust were perhaps a kind of self-reinforcing bundle of culture that was a response to the Atlantic slave trade. If you have any idea of how to sort of conduct this exercise more cleanly, then I'd really appreciate that.
Yes, my question is about, it's not clear to me from your presentation, how do you see the relationship of the reinforcement, let's say, of witchcraft belief in relation to religions? It's not clear in what way it goes, because, as you know, religions, monotheist religions, are against witchcraft and they want to combat it, but at the same time they're interpreted by Africans in the same way as witchcraft. So there is the world of evil and the devil that is playing a role, and so I'd like to see some interaction with the existing religion that is in the area that you are considering, because even your geographic distribution of witchcraft, as you have seen in the tropical lowlands, is the area where monotheist religions have not penetrated. So I would like to know more about religious, which also believe in supernatural things as compared to witchcraft.
Okay, so I hope we can talk over lunch more about it, but just very briefly, almost 100% of the sample identify themselves as either Christian or Muslim. So all of these witchcraft believers at the same time are claiming that they are Muslim or Christian. But there is an interesting mechanics, and I spent a little bit of time looking at that. There's an interesting dynamics in terms of competition for souls on part of religions, and it looks roughly this way. The old-style mainline Christians are kind of against that stuff, so it's either Jesus or witchcraft, but the new lines of Christians, like Pentecostals, they actually leverage those local beliefs to recruit more people, because they allow these types of rituals like exorcisms and so on, and so it kind of blends quite nicely together.
Great, thanks a lot.